Hi, everybody. My name is Chris Spiller from the Bodie Foundation. And the Bodie Foundation, of course, is the nonprofit that supports Bodie. We fund things like stabilization and several other projects. If you'd like to find out more about what we do, please go to bodiefoundation.org. We'd love to have you remember to help us save Bodie. And today we're going to take you on a little tour of a closed area of the park, an area that you can't go when you visit the park. But we'd like to tell you about some of the technology that was so remarkable here in Bodie, even in the later years. And today we're going to be talking about cyanide. Scary stuff, poisonous stuff. In fact, one part of our presentation, we're going to be reading you some excerpts from the diary of the superintendent, who had a rather interesting experience in the cyanide plant. So come along with us today. It should be fun. The strange thing about cyanide is it's been around for a long time. In the 1700s, scientists noticed that it would dissolve gold and silver in a lab. But they made no practical use of cyanide in the industrial world till the 1800s. And cyanide came to Bodie in 1894. And the first cyanide plant ever was in a town in Colorado. And Bodie was not too far behind that. Thomas Leggett was the superintendent here then, and he eagerly grabbed onto this new technology. This would give a great boost to Bodie's coffers. You see, if you've been on our stamp mill tour, you know that the amalgamation process, that's the process that used mercury. Well, that process only recovered 60 to 65% of the gold and silver. The rest would go out with the dirt and pile up below the stamp mill. So they had all this gold and silver locked up in there, but no way to get at it, no practical way. I suppose you could pan it, but that wouldn't be very practical. So the cyanide process was a great idea for them. Thomas Leggett, in 1894, built the first tailing plant for the Standard Company right around the corner from us here, and it was right between a tunnel that the Standard used called the Boulevard and the ponds. And the ponds were filled with water, but they also were just stuffed with tailings. And they quickly set about getting horses and mules to rake up these tailings. And using harrows and plows, and they even used Fresno scrapers to really scrape that stuff up and get it loaded into wagons. And if you don't know what a Fresno scraper is, you may have heard about scrapers used in road construction. And Fresno scrapers were one of the more common devices for that. Now, once they got it all scraped up, they would move it to the plant. And at the plant, they're putting this material, the tailings, into big wooden vats with a cyanide solution. That would be mostly water with 1 to 2% of cyanide. So they don't need very much, but just a little bit could dissolve the gold and silver. And it would soak in there. It would take all day to fill it up. And eventually, they would get the gold and silver into solution. Now we've got the gold and silver in solution, and we're ready to go on to the next process in the cyanide plant. And we have to separate the gold and silver away from the cyanide now. And this sounds like it's getting complicated, and it is a complicated process, and we're not going to go into a lot of detail. But suffice it to say, the zinc shavings are in the trough, and the solution containing the gold and silver runs over the zinc shavings, and that causes a reaction where the gold and silver will precipitate out. And then they're able to take that out and eventually make their gold bars out of it. Now, the cyanide process was a success. They were getting 70 to 80% of the gold and silver out of all these tailings. And it was a great thing for them to start breaking even here at the Standard Company. They hadn't been doing that for a few years. But there were still problems. Despite building a couple more cyanide plants, in fact, various companies built cyanide plants all up and down the Bodie Canyon. There were probably about 11. The Standard would build 2 more. And by the time the 1900s roll around, Robert Chester Turner, who is now the superintendent, has a new problem. There's still these tailings that won't work well with the cyanide process, and they're called the slimes, like in Ghostbusters. And the slimes had a lot of clay in them, and if you tried to process that in the cyanide vats, the clay would go down and block the filter, so that didn't work very well. And this problem was turned over to the new assistant superintendent, a man named Theodore Hoover, who got here in 1903. Hoover, newly graduated from Stanford University, was given this problem of the slimes, as they called it. And he did a lot of experimentations, and by 1904, he was busy building, or I should say renovating, the present tailing plant. And he was going to use the Moore filter process. Now, Mr. Moore built a process where it was a machine, it was really a vacuum pump, and it would lower into the solution, and they'd flip a switch, and it would vacuum up the gold and silver out of that slimy material. And it worked really well. They got the mill running at a profit by the end of 1905. But Hoover decided to do one more thing to get the values up, and we're going to take a look at that in a minute. Hi again. We're standing here in front of the tube mill, and if you're kind of wondering what this is, I'm going to explain, but essentially it's like a big rock tumbler. If you were a rock hound as a kid and you wanted to polish your rocks up, you'd put them in here. The tube mill is a little different. In 1904, Theodore Hoover, now the superintendent, moved up from assistant, he ordered this tube mill, and he said it was the first one in the United States, in fact, the first one outside of South Africa. So Hoover took material from not only the stamp mill, and that material was very coarse, and he took more tailings and more of those slimes. And his idea was that if he ground them up more finely, he could extract the very coarse sands out of it, and he could run that through the cyanide process. So to do that, he was using Icelandic flints. Again, all the way from Iceland. He at first used irregular pebbles from Mono Lake, but being irregular, they didn't crush the material. It didn't make good enough contact, and it kind of slid all over this. So this thing would have been moving around with the material grinding against the Icelandic flints. And what would it look like when it was all over? It would be about 200 mesh. That would be like talcum powder. I brought along my clipboard because I want to read you a few quotes from Theodore Hoover, because he had a really interesting incident one night in the cyanide plant, and he wrote about it in his memoirs. He explained that one night in 1904, when the plant out here, which of course burned down in the 1950s, was being renovated, he was working late with a crew and the company's general manager, Robert Gilman Brown, a very well-known mining man. Hoover recalled that he became thirsty and went to the zinc room to get a drink of water from the spring water faucet. It only took about 5 minutes for Hoover to feel ill. He said, "I thought it was fatigue and loss of sleep." Another minute or so later, he looked up, thinking that all the machinery had stopped running as it was suddenly silent. He saw the machinery was running and realized he had lost his hearing. He said, "Then my hearing came back with a bang. In a few minutes, hearing was gone again, also sense of touch, and also, I suppose, taste and smell. By this time, I was becoming excited, and my mind was working rapidly to fathom the cause." He went and found Mr. Brown. He told him what happened. By now, the cycles of lost hearing and touch were recurring every 6 minutes. Hoover suddenly said to himself, all of a sudden, it flashed through my mind whether it was possible I had taken a drink of cyanide solution, and I mentioned it to Mr. Brown, who thought it was impossible. Nevertheless, the two men went down to the zinc room, drew a dipper of water from the spring water tap, and it did smell like cyanide, but as Hoover pointed out in his memoirs, a cyanide plant really smells quite strongly of cyanide. So they decided on a laboratory test. Now remember I said that gold and silver dissolves in the cyanide solution. They began dropping a standard silver solution into the drinking water, and the two men watched for a reaction. Hoover recalled, quote, "Drop by drop the water took up the solution, and my hair began to rise straight up." The test determined that Hoover's drink of water was the standard strength of 2 pounds of cyanide per ton of water. Now, he was a little nervous about this, but he recovered from his nervousness. I don't know if we all would just be nervous. He was scared. After the first flush of fright, however, I felt that I had lived the better part of half an hour since drinking. The chances were the poison would not get me that time. As the hours went by, the instances of his loss of hearing and other sensations were getting farther and farther apart, and after 24 hours, disappeared entirely. So what caused the safety flaw? Hoover explained that an incorrect pipe connection resulted in the cyanide solution on one side of the valve being under higher pressure than the spring water on the other side, so the cyanide solution began to leak into the spring water very slowly. Hoover summed up, "If it had not been discovered in time, many men might have been killed." So a narrow escape for our superintendent, and pretty exciting day for him. I'm sure something that he never forgot the rest of his life. I'd like to thank you for coming along today. We will probably have some more of these videos, and again, the Bodie Foundation thanks you. If you'd like to join us, again, bodiefoundation.org. See you later.